California's public pension system is in a crisis. The shortfall between retirement benefits that were promised and the money to pay those obligations, known as unfunded liability, continues to grow, and those increased costs are challenging governments at every level. Why do public pension costs in California keep climbing? And is there anything we can do about it? Our guest is Judy Lin with CalMatters, a nonprofit journalism venture that recently partnered with the LA Times and Capital Public Radio on a series of articles exploring the consequences of California's public employee pension challenge.
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. While CalPERS, the California Public Employee Retirement System, is the largest pension system in the United States, many Californians, and indeed many of the 1.8 million beneficiaries, have precious little knowledge about this financial behemoth. Our guest is Judy Lin, who works with CalMatters, recently partnered with the LA Times and the Capital Public Radio on an in-depth look at the state's public employee pensions here in California, and CalPERS in particular. So welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you.
So what is CalPERS? Who does it cover? What does it do?
Yeah, it is actually the nation's largest public pension system. It holds about $300 billion in assets, and all of that is to cover, as you mentioned, the 1.8 million state employees, school workers who are non-teachers, cities and counties that contract with CalPERS. So this is, from water agencies all the way up to Caltrans workers. These are...
so it's not just state employees, it's also local employees.
Yes.
Though teachers, as you mentioned, specifically have their own pension system. So you're saying the amount of money that they're in control of, or assets that they're dealing with, about $300 billion. Where does that money come from?
It's a combination through employee contributions. They take a part of their paycheck goes to retirement. The employers, as in the government and taxpayers, put in a chunk. But by and large, 2/3 of that money is gains on investments, and that is...
assuming there are gains on investments, right?
Yes.
So how is that supposed to work?
And so the idea is that you pre-fund it. Everybody's pre-funding as an employee works during his or her working years. And once they're approaching retirement, there will have been enough gains to cover all of that person's pensions. The problem is we had two big hits. We had a dot-com
big
bust.
Hits.
Yes. We had a dot-com bust in the early 2000s, and then the recession, the Great Recession in 2008. And that really, just in that 1 year, for example, CalPERS' housing portfolio dropped 50%.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of people, I'm sure, if they're looking at their 401k, which is a different kind of pension, that's called a defined contribution plan. What we're talking about is a defined benefit plan. And just to be clear about that, defined benefit plan is a situation where the employer basically is saying, we're promising you this benefit when you retire. A defined contribution plan, like a 401k, is you can set money aside, but you make a bad investment, that's on you.
Yes.
So it's very different where the risks are in those
Yes.
two systems. So a big crash, and initially, I'm curious, are they looking to fund the entire liability, or they're trying to fund like a portion of it? I've read places where it's prudent to have 80% coverage of the liability. Others say, no, you have to have 100%. So I guess it depends what's considered prudent in terms of covering that liability.
Yeah, and so different people will give you different answers.
Right.
Ideally, it should be 100%. That is the goal. You better have a dollar to pay that pensioner
Right.
for every dollar that you owe that person.
But they're not assuming everyone's going to retire at the same point, so they probably figure they can do the ish.
Yeah, there is
bit.
wiggle room. Obviously, actuarial. Accounting is a really complex
Right.
and difficult
Actuarial science.
Yeah.
My sister-in-law is an actuary, and so it gets very complicated very fast. So employees contribute a portion of their pensions, and then you said taxpayers, the government does as well. How much do each contribute?
Generally, the employees contribute probably 8 to 13% nowadays. Before it was as little as 5% or none at all. Mm-hmm. Employers, right now, for example, the state civil servant the state will contribute 24. But things have gotten so bad because of those two hits that the unfunded liability is facing tens of billions of dollars in debt, that the employers are having to pay more, up to 50% of a CHP officer's
The CHP
pay.
is particular where they got, frankly, a very generous pension. And you can argue either way whether they should have that or not. I mean, they negotiated that, but that's what their pension is. So how is CalPERS administered? Who's on the board? How does that work?
So it's a 13-member board, largely dominated by labor, pro-labor supporters, Democrats. You have employee representatives, employer representatives. The governor has 2 appointees, and there are statewide officers, for example, the state controller and state treasurer, who sit on the board.
Okay, so it sounds like the board is not a neutral board. It seems a little bit like it might be leaning a little one way.
Yeah, you can characterize it that way, because it certainly is. Democrats definitely look to public employee unions for support, and the employees themselves want the pension system to protect retirees.
Yeah, and according to your reporting, 6 of the 13 are elected by active and retired employees to represent different constituencies. So they're specifically representing employees.
Yes.
Okay, well, up next, thanks for explaining the basics of CalPERS. Up next, so what about the decisions of Republican and Democratic governors in the 1990s that have apparently backfired, and we're dealing with those consequences today? We're going to have a conversation about that in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Judy Lin from Cal Matters about California's public employee pension system. CalPERS board we were talking about earlier, fiercely independent of the legislature and the governor. But in the early 1990s, some things happened, really for a short-term fix for some unprecedented budget deficits that had some long-term consequences. What happened in the 1990s?
Yeah, let's start with 1991, when Pete Wilson comes in. He's a Republican. He had a plurality of votes, and he is, coming in to work with Democrats. And there's a budget deficit of like $14 billion.
And back in the day, that was really big.
That's really bad. And so they're looking for any way to save without cutting the poor and students, schools of that nature. So they, Wilson maneuvers to get more control over CalPERS, and wants to take over actuarial predictions and also take more control over the board. That clearly backfired, and
he wanted to take over control of the board, so the board would agree that maybe he wouldn't have to make as much in terms of contributions, right?
Yes.
And so lower the contributions would mean he'd have more money to pay for that $14 billion deficit.
Yes, yes. And so he wanted to massage the rate of return, use rosier assumptions. And so in response, Labor put up an initiative. It was called Prop 162, and it barely passed. It just passed by 1%, if I recall.
That's a pretty close vote.
It's a pretty close vote. But it essentially locked in CalPERS's independence. And also what's really notable is that it gave the CalPERS a directive that you shall make retirees your priority. Everything is about
exclusive
protecting
priority.
them. Yeah, yeah.
And before that, they used to have something called the 3 co-equal responsibilities, right? You were supposed to have a pension system set up to provide retirement benefits to government workers, to minimize contributions by the state, and then also to spend reasonably on administration. Those last 2 dropped, and the focus became making sure the benefits are received by the government workers, correct?
Yes.
And that changed how they basically operated? Yes,
very much so. It was, if you're thinking you're a city or a county making your contributions, you pay into this fund, but the board is not going to be responsive to you. So that could be frustrating.
It also made CalPERS kind of the sole and exclusive, they had the power to manage now this fund. They didn't have to really report to anyone. So they don't have to report to anyone, and their sole focus is making sure government pensions are paid.
Yes.
That's a big change. And I think that's a response, you said, to Governor Wilson's attempt to gain control. There was a pushback. So then we have 1999, 7 years later, and important decisions were made that really charted the current course that we're on. And that was done by Governor Gray Davis, a Democrat, with SB 400 that he signed. Tell us the story behind SB 400.
Yeah, well, in that, switch from 1999 with the deficit to 1991 to 1999, you had a big swing. We're now in a dot-com bubble. We're Wall Street seeing astronomical returns, double digits. These surpluses are running high, and the numbers are staggering. And so here comes...
so you got a surplus now in the fund.
Yeah.
And so you don't have to worry about paying money in. And so they're telling legislators, hey, don't worry about it. In fact, I think the projection was for the next 11 years, you're not going to have to pay anything. It didn't turn out quite that way, because stock markets never keep going up. What goes up must come down. And so then what happened? They changed some things in pension formulas.
Yeah. So CalPERS comes before the lawmakers and says, hey, we have enough money here. Things are going so well. We can give our employees, our hardworking employees, retroactive and ongoing future increases toward their pension benefits. And this was signed by Governor Davis with very, very little discussion, apparently. And the chief actuary at the time, Ron Sealing, did make a prediction that if things were...
He had three different scenarios, a very rosy scenario, a kind of okay scenario, and a bad scenario.
Yes.
And we seem to want to hear the bad scenario. Right?
Yes, and of course the bad scenario is pretty much what played out.
What happened?
Yeah.
What's interesting though, when you take a look at the numbers, they said Highway Patrol is a good example. Prior to this change in the law, typical average pension was $62,000. After this change, same person, same years of service, was now going to make $96,000 as a pension. So, I mean, a third of increase. It's a huge increase with that one change. So they made this change, and now the reverberations are now going forward because we had the dot-com bust and the housing bust. Stock market went down.
Yes.
And so the reliance on investment returns, that income wasn't there.
Yeah.
And so now we've got the hole that we're dealing with.
Yes.
Okay, so that leads us where we are today, and we're going to talk about the current liability. What does it mean for government retirees? And what extent is the public pension debt in California going up, going down, or staying the same? We'll talk about that in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Judy Lin with Cal Matters, recently partnered with the LA Times and Capital Public Radio in a series about the looming challenges with California's public employee pension systems. Several years now there's been a lot of talk about this unfunded liability, the shortfall between the benefits promised and the money set aside to meet those obligations. So let's talk about those numbers. What are we talking about in terms of numbers here?
Yeah, they're pretty staggering. When Governor Gray Davis approved the enhanced benefits in 1999, we had a surplus of $58 million. Today, according to the State Controller's Office, and this is as of 2014, all public pension systems are facing a $241 billion liability.
That's state and local.
That is state and local. It's all public pension systems.
You said billion, not million.
Billion, yeah.
It's not a big number.
It's a big number. On top of that, I would add that a lot of these local...
By the way, just to put that into perspective for people, the state budget is what? A little over $100 billion, right?
Yes.
110, 120
yeah,
billion
the
dollars.
general fund is about 110.
Right, so it's twice the size of the annual state budget.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, just put it in perspective.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I interrupted you. So we have this amount of debt. By the way, there's also something called public employee retirement health insurance. There's also an obligation there as well to pay for that. How much is that liability?
Yeah, that's in the tens of billions of dollars. The state alone has a 72 or 74 billion dollar liability. Once a state employee retires, they get health benefits for themselves and their beneficiaries for life. It's a benefit that's worth about $20,000 a year.
Yeah, that's pretty significant. And I was reading in your articles, they're saying if you combine the public employee pension liability and the public employee health insurance liability, total 366. The tab is $366 billion.
Yeah.
That's a big amount of money. And it's also, that means it's increasing the amount taken out of the general fund each year, right? So that money can't be used for other things. It has to be used to pay off those obligations.
Yeah, we've seen that obligation just skyrocket. It's hundreds of millions of dollars each year and growing. That's less money that's available for schools and social services.
I want to say it was $5.4 billion, I think, in the last general fund allocation. So out of a $110-20 billion budget, $5 billion or so is to pay these pension obligations. It's not that you shouldn't pay those pension obligations, but just that number keeps going up. So why is it unfunded liability getting so big? Is it just problems with the investments?
There's that, yeah, and there, to be fair, looking back, you do have state governments that took pension holidays that didn't make contributions when times were good.
These are local governments.
These are, yeah, and the state, and so there is that part. There's also the aspect that you talked about. The investments have not hit their marks. There's an assumption that they'll return 7.5%, and we've fallen below that.
Yeah, but if you look at the historical market average of what the market has done over the last 100 years, that's not an unreasonable number. But if it doesn't hit that, and then now we have a baby boom generation that's retiring, you get the double whammy. Yeah. And oh, by the way, they're living longer. So retiring earlier, living longer with a higher payout, and there's the gap. So it sounds like it's pretty tough to deal with this issue on the state level, politics involved. What about the local level? You're hearing bankruptcies now in certain cities like Vallejo and San Bernardino and Stockton. Could we be seeing the public employee pension issue really be kind of shifting to the local level? And seeing that's where the fights are occurring? Yeah,
and so the state, obviously being so large, has the wherewithal to deal with the funding problems, the shortages, and so that the state is, by and large, other than less money for other things, can get by. Locals are in a different position, where $1 million will be chump change to the state. $1 million could.
I think they refer to it as budget dust.
So, yes, yes. $1 million can take a special water district under. Go into bankruptcy, and this is right now at a time when the economy is doing fairly well. We've seen good job growth in our state, and so if things are already getting tight now, what does that mean when the economy does turn? Yeah,
and in your series of articles, you mentioned San Jose, and their pension liability went from $73 million in 2001 to $245 million in 2012. The city had to lay off 25% of its workforce, so it has some local implications. Before we get out of this segment, I wanted to ask you about CalSTRS, the state teacher fund, which you've written about. Education's beginning some pretty healthy increases. Is that fund okay, or is it the same kind of shape as CalPERS?
They're both under 70% funded right now, so they're both not in the healthiest position. But at the same time, the governor did pass some reforms to increase contributions from the school districts and the teachers. So there is a plan in place. It's really too early to tell. What we do know is that all the additional funding that's been going to schools, as much as 40% of that could be the growth of that. 40% of it could be going to pensions
to deal with this issue. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit more about attempts at reform in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking to Cal Matters reporter Judy Lin about California's public employee pension system. You know, it's not unlike there have been attempts to address this issue. In 2012, for example, Governor Brown signed a bill that capped benefits, increased the retirement age, and required state employees to pay at least half of their pension costs. The governor said this is the biggest rollback in the history of California. Has it had a significant impact?
It's hard to say. Some would say yes, some would say no, some would say it's too early to tell. But we do know that costs are still rising because mostly his reforms dealt with new employees. And the savings from those new employees won't be felt for decades to come as the workforce turns over. So
there will be billions of dollars of savings, it's just 20, 30 years out.
30 years out,
right.
Yeah. And so so yes, he has reined in some of the most egregious abuses, like double dipping, spiking.
Spiking is where that last year they kind of all of a sudden their salary goes from one number and 30,000 on top of it, and the pension's based on the highest salary.
Right.
So if you get 1 year of very high salary, you get that pension for the rest of your life.
Yeah, and for new employees, it's now based on 3. So hopefully that balances.
Which is
out.
pretty typical in the private sector, where pensions still exist.
Right.
Let me ask you about it was a bipartisan attempt by San Jose Democrat Mayor Chuck Reed and a Republican council member from San Diego to put a pension measure on the ballot this year. They pulled it back, and they said, we're going to wait for 2018, a non-presidential year. Was that all about timing, or was that maybe the public's appetite for this issue is just kind of waning?
Well, no. So it's always how it's presented, right? If it's a question presented to voters as, do you support pension reform? By and large, voters will say yes. But do you support taking death benefits from officers' widows, or do you support cutting teachers and firefighters and their retirement benefits? The answer is no. And so it's interesting. I think what Chuck Reed ran into was how the summary was framed by a Democratic Attorney General Kamala Harris.
Right.
That was
who is running for U.S. Senate. And,
yes.
Okay, so politics may play a role in
yes.
this. Yeah,
yes.
It's interesting though. If public employees, and I am one, they say, well, listen, this is deferred compensation. You're paying me a low salary during my career, and you're deferring my compensation to retirement. Is the argument on the employee side correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and so I guess pay me now or pay me later. And so the problem is the pay me later is a little bit. It's hard now to meet that obligation. It's interesting. A lot of local governments now are asking voters to approve sales tax increases, 80 this year alone, which is, I guess, the most on record. In a Bloomberg article, they said that a lot of these are aimed at specific projects, road projects or what have you, but some of them are just extra cash for localities so they can meet their obligations. One of those big obligations is public employee pensions. Are cities worried maybe that the CalPERS is going to drop the discount rate from 7.5% to 7%, which means the cities then have to put in more money to make up that difference? Are they worried about this?
Yes, absolutely. It's an ongoing issue right now with the CalPERS board. They're having to make a decision whether or not they adjust that rate. If you talk to board members like John Chung, Betty Yee, the state controller and state treasurer, their view is we should be slow and steady and think long term. And so they
don't want to make radical shifts, in other
yeah,
words, because that
yes.
could really hit a local government. I mean, if you drop that discount rate too much, all of a sudden you're asking a city or to pay a lot of money into it. So they want to kind of ease it,
yes.
make that change over time.
Yes.
It's hard to make that change, though, I'd assume.
Yeah, it's very hard, and it's a
because
tough
the focus
decision.
of the board is also taking care of the beneficiaries.
Yeah, and if you reduce it, you're having to make up it for investment somewhere else. You may have to go to more risky investments, and they may not produce the results that you want. They could be, very devastating, or return really well for you. The risk.
That is the decision everyone with a 401k has to make, right? Yes. How risky do they want to be? How risk averse are you?
Yes.
There was recently a Marin County case that some think may open the door to pension benefit reductions. Some people are calling it a game changer. What do you think? It's all about the California rule. You might want to explain what the California rule is and then what this decision did.
Sure. Generally, courts have been very favorable. Our history in California is that the courts have generally sided with protecting pensions. They saw it as a contract that when you signed on to be a city employee, this was the benefit you were guaranteed. So if you were ever to a city was ever trying to take that away, they are supposed to offer you something
An equivalent benefit.
equivalent, if not better,
Which is
benefit.
no savings than if it's an equivalent benefit.
Right, and so that it really locks in their ties, locks them in on these costs. And so this decision that's being challenged to the Supreme Court is really being watched heavily, closely, because it cracks that door open and says, no, you can make adjustments if it's reasonable.
Yeah, as
You're
long as it's a
entitled.
reasonable pension.
Yes.
So I guess we're going to find out what a reasonable pension is in the coming months. I want to thank Judy Lynn from Cal Matters for joining us. If you want to stay up to date on state and local politics, you can look at our e-newsletter, the Maddy Daily, or look at our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Keppler from the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.